Um, Recording is in progress. Okay, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. What I wanted to cover this morning is because right now in Israel, so for Nina.
We just spoke to her.
Oh, okay, good. But does the beehive doesn't get in the way of the phone, right? Doesn't. Yes, I know Nina since she was in high school, so it's we love her. We're big fans. So in Israel tonight begins Yom Hazikaron, and then of course that in some miraculous fashion, which is just mind-boggling, and if you have to see it to believe it, but how that day of just absolute horrific mourning morphs into a day of tremendous celebration. It's really something to see, and it's really challenging. It's so gut-wrenching on so many different ways.
Morning.
Morning going one way and then going back the other way to Simcha. It's really, I mean, if that doesn't sort of encapsulate the story of our people, I don't know what does. But there they do it in a period of 24 hours. So while we would spend a lot of time talking about Yom Ha'atzmaut, I don't think we spend enough time talking about Yom Hazikaron, which is Israel's Memorial Day for Fallen. And if you're interested in numbers, so it now includes not only soldiers who fell in war, people serving in the services. So that's Army, it's people who work in consider them the service. If you let's say if you work in jails, things like that, those types of services. So that's all included, and police, Mishmar Gavul. But the number of fallen is 24,068, and now they've included also in that number is unfortunately victims of terror, which stands at 4,216, and unfortunately as recently as this last Friday night in Ariel, so with the number is 28,284. 28,284, which is just unbearable. So I want to give tribute that every person mourns in Israel mourns on Yom HaZikaron, and we do as well. And while we have to celebrate, of course, the victories of Yom Ha'atzmaut, we have to understand the sacrifices and what got us there. So what I as you know, I teach every day. I teach from the Penine Halacha from Rav Melamed, and I actually came across this by accident because my volume that I have in my set is a first edition, and since this particular volume, which is called Ha'am v'Ha'aretz, which is all Israel-related things. So, for instance, if you look in the table of contents, it talks about the beauty of living in Israel, the mitzvah to live in Israel, laws of the army, guarding the Medina, relations with the neighbors, all these types of things are all covered in this volume. But in the volume that we bought for the shul here, and I just happened to look at it during davening, and I found that this was redone in Tafshin Ayin Ches. Okay, the original one was Tafshin Samach Hey. So then a bunch of years later, 13 years later, they redid it. And one of the things that was redid was there's actually a eulogy that Rav Melamed gave for a resident of Har Bracha who was a victim of a terror attack. So I want to talk about that, and nothing is by accident. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll show it to people here. And you'll see why this is kind of like a little eerie almost. So I'm sure you probably remember this story, but here's a story. I'll read you the article, but it says a father of 4 murdered in Ariel terror attack. So he was murdered in the entrance of Ariel at the bus stop. The incident that we just had on Friday night, a young man, and he was laid to rest, and he shielded his fiance and saved her life. I mean, if you could just imagine, and like one story is just more horrific than the next. So we have in a few weeks, we have Miriam Peretz is coming for Shabbos. She is like the Israel Gold Star mom. She's unbelievable. So I actually over Shabbos was rereading her book, which is just, it's like a kick in the gut in every chapter. And what she's been able to do with her life and to turn it into a life of meaning, and she inspires people. And when you talk to her, it's like talking to your bubby. I have all these WhatsApp messages back and forth between her and me, and it's like you just want to give her like a big hug, like she's amazing. She actually ran for president of Israel, and she lost out the election to Bougie Herzog in the most recent election. So here in this story, I'll just read you. Rabbi Tamar Ben Gal was murdered in a stabbing attack Monday afternoon, the settlement of Ariel in Samaria region of West Bank. This I took from Ynet News. Now, when you look up an article, an old story, it just brings up other very horrible feelings of just because you see how different people report these incidents, different news outlets. So I just took from Ynet, pretty part. Okay. So Mada, assisted by IDF Medical Force, first treated the victim who suffered wounds to his upper body, and he performed resuscitation. He was then taken to Bellinson. Of course, he was pronounced dead. Ben Gal from the Har Bracha settlement in Samaria region. So that's why this is important. Har Bracha, Rav Melamed is the Rav in Har Bracha. In Har Bracha, he was from Har Bracha, and he was an educator in Bnei Akiva Yeshiva in Givat Shmuel, and he is survived by his wife Miriam and 4 children. And here we have this beautiful, beautiful photo. I'll pass this around. Let's see this beautiful family. And unfortunately, there are way too many children who have grown up with a murdered parent, and they've had to grow up on their own. So, and it's nice when we hear sort of the follow-up stories of years later, how they functioning, how they get together, how they got married, moved on. And this is something I take very much to heart. I've had many Shiva calls and visits with victims of terror, and it's just and the one thing that I can say is that from our point of view, or really how they look at us, well, what can we do? You know what? When you show up, it means I can't even tell you what it means to them, because they just kind of like, I mean, my quintessential story of this nature is when we were in 2016, we happened to be in Israel. My parents, they wanted to have all of their grandchildren together in Israel. My sister lives in Israel. She has 8 children, Kananahara, and my parents, we pulled it off, and we had this big family trip in 2016. Moshe was 6 months old. His first time in Israel, he was 6 months old. He was there a couple of times in utero, but 6 months old. And we have this beautiful picture. We have it in all our homes of all of us at the Kotel. It was a Friday morning in January. We said to the kids, we gave them the right act, like, I don't care if it's freezing. You're going to get there. You're going to smile. We're not wearing coats. We're going to wear. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day. And that picture and that visit is the only time that my parents ever had all of their grandchildren together. One and only time for that week or so, which is such a treasure. But during that week, we were they were ATVing, or, like the usual touristy stuff. And it was actually Keith Mendelson, his father passed away. And I managed to get to Har HaMenuchos so I could be there for the burial for Keith's father. Keith and I go back a long way. We were in high school together. And I said, like, I'm in Israel, I should go. And I was able to find there. And Har HaMenuchos is big, but by luck, I found somebody who's going down, like, yeah, okay, so we went, and I was there for the Kvura. But right afterwards, I had my guy, and when I have a lot of guys, my guy, we drove to Otniel. Now, Otniel is not exactly a nice drive, because you got to go through some fun places. It's like the bottom, it's south of Hebron, and it's like it's like the bottom of Route 60 before you get to Beersheba. Okay. And the reason why we went to Otniel is because that the day or two before is when there was this wonderful nurse. Her name was Daphne Meir, Hashem Yikam Dama. So Daphne Meir was murdered in her own home by terrorists, and she actually fought off. And her daughter Renana, who was 16 at the time, found her mother, and she was frantic. But she actually, from like the little training that they all have emergency training. She knew not to remove the knife from her mother. And mother's lying in the kitchen, and she comes home, and she knew, because like that's, they say leave it in and whatever, but her mother succumbed to her wounds and she died. Her father, Baruch Hashem, Renana got married. Her father, Natan, who's became a big advocate, but he got remarried. But Daphne Meir, and she was just, and they wrote a beautiful book about her. Yafa Erlach wrote this book. She's a newspaper reporter, but she wrote a book about her. It's in Hebrew. I actually broke my teeth to read this book in Hebrew. I go down there to Otniel, and I go to the Shiva. So first we get to the yeshiva. There's a beautiful, beautiful yeshiva in Otniel. Gorgeous yeshiva overlooking the mountains. They're so welcoming. I walk in, can I give you something to drink? The Rav is giving the Shiur. It was a Thursday night. I go. I'm like, can you tell us where the Shiva house is? Of course, everybody knows. The director's to the Shiva house. And We get there and we're just sitting there. And Israeli / Sephardic custom, they're passing around tea and they're passing around drinks. They want everybody. The reason is in Sephardic customs they want people to make a bracha. Ashkenazim we're still like, I can eat in a shiva house, right? Or it's really you're not supposed to take food from a shiva. But to eat in a shiva house, a whole different story. By the way, parenthetically, I say if the food's going to go to waste, please go to a shiva house and give it away. Better you should do a mitzvah.
Say it again.
So
Doing anything yet? Yes.
We get there and I'm sitting there and it's a cold January night and people coming in and out. And what I cannot get the image out of my mind is the fact that I'm sitting here in the salon in the living room and literally like 10 feet away is where she was murdered. Right. So it was just like really like they cleaned it up, obviously, but you can't get that out of your head. And I'm sitting there and finally he's talking to people and then he comes, his English is not good at all in the time. And Renana and she's the oldest one that had younger kids. And he walks up to me and he just says like this, he goes like this, he goes, just like that. Like, who are you? What are you doing here? And I said, in my best Hebrew that I could say, I said, I'm a rabbi from New Jersey. I'm in Israel. I wanted to pay my respects. I want you to feel like, you're not alone. And he starts crying and he hugs me and he says, you know what? It's going to be okay. Like all of Israel is one. Like all Klal Israel is one. And that taught me, I said, you know what? The best thing that you could do is to show up. If you're there for people, it means a lot to them. You're not going to bring back their loved one. You're not going to ease their pain, but when you help share their burden, they get it. So when you look at a picture of a family like this, okay, he arrives, and they found this terrorist, by the way, actually it was just a more recent report that he got a life sentence. And he arrives, he was stabbed, he ran to the bus station. So whatever, here's the whole news story. We don't need to go through the whole news story. So what I came across completely by accident here, and is Rav Melamed gave a hesped. He gave a eulogy for this Rav Ben-Gal, and here we have it in front of you. And I wanted to share it with you. And I think that in honor of Yom Hazikaron, so that these holy souls should never ever be forgotten, and we should know their stories. And it's very possible that it starts on the right, on the where the staple's on the top right. There it is. If you ever find yourself in Har Bracha, which by the way I would highly recommend visiting, beautiful. I mean, if you are willing to go to such places, I love going there, and beautiful wineries and seeing the fields growing, and just you could get, it's historical Israel, which we discussed when we talked about Har Grizim and Har Ival. It's called Har Bracha because it's on Har Grizim. So it overlooks Shechem. So you're talking about the northern part of the Shomron. It overlooks Shechem, and the bracha, the mountain where the Jews received the blessings and the curses when they came to Israel. It's literally right there. So that's why it's called Har Bracha. And they they have a yeshiva there, beautiful. So here I'm going to read from this hesped. Let me just blow it up a little bit for you. Okay, let me move the window out of the way. Okay, so it says, this is the Hesped Kadosh Harav Itamar Ben Gal, and that Hey Yadalit is always Hashem Yakum Domo, that Hashem should avenge his blood. Some people don't like that. I happen to like that because, you know what? His blood needs avenging. So, B'chof Shvat, Neharag al Kiddush Hashem Harav Itamar Ben Gal Hashem Yakum Domo. Mipe'er Gidula Yeshivaseinu. He says on the 20th of Shvat, he died al Kiddush Hashem, but not died. He was killed. He was murdered, and he was one of the greats of, he says, of our yeshiva, because he was from Har Bracha. B'chayav u'v'moto masar harav Itamar et levavo nafsho u'modo al gili Torat Eretz Yisrael v'al hachinuch l'Torah u'mitzvot v'al yishuv haaretz. He says that in his whole life and in his death, Rav Itamar, he gave his heart, he gave his soul, he gave all of his possessions to give over the Torah of Israel, to educate people to Torah and mitzvos, to settle the land of Israel. B'kav harishon shel hisyashvus b'Har Bracha, and he was one of the first when they settled in Har Bracha. Sefer zeh she'osek ba'am ha'aretz mukdash l'ilui nishmaso. Elu divrei hesped she'amarti b'havaya. So this volume of Ha'am Ha'aretz, which is again the later version, the second version, is now sanctified. He says it's dedicated in his name and his memory. So think about it. When we're learning this sefer, every word of Torah will bring an Eloi, will bring an Aliyah to the neshama of Harav Itamar. So Pit'om be'emtza hayom hikta b'no hashmua. Ananim afurim shel bechi hitavu b'shamayim v'kol nara hitpashet ba'olam v'hodia. I'm trying to read this in the way that maybe Rav Melamed would say it, and not in my like Ashkenazis, so I'm sure some people might appreciate that. He says, immediately in the middle of the day, the plague struck. He says that there were these dark clouds of crying that formed in the sky, and this great, awesome sound spread in the world, the Hodia, and was let known, Harav Itamar ben Gal mehar bracha nirtzach. The word spreads very quickly, unfortunately, that Rav Itamar ben Gal was murdered. Upitom Miriam Almana, and then all of a sudden, his wife Miriam, she's a widow, and then Avital, Daniel, Roni, Avraham Yitomim, and these four children, and we saw these beautiful children in the picture, and this is 2018, so they're 4 years older now, and you wonder, Avital, Daniel, Roni, and Avraham, they're now orphans. Limduna Rabotenu, Shakol Yehudi she'neharag mipnei hayoto Yehudi nikra kadosh. Umuftach lo shu ben olam haba. So the rabbis teach us that any Jew who was killed because he was Jewish is called a kadosh, a holy soul, sanctified, and it's guaranteed that he's going to go to olam haba. B'moto al hayoto Yehudi poshatet malbushav hapratiim v'hitatef b'kedushat Yisrael. When you die because you're Jewish, so you take off your individual clothing, and then you're actually, he says, I love the language he uses, and you actually cloak yourself with the sanctity of Israel. He says, and if this is how we say about any Jew, imagine how much more so on someone who decided to, kind of be a pioneer in sowing the land of Israel, the Kava Rishon Shalit Yashvut, and the original settlement on Har Bracha, and how much more so when we're talking about a Torah scholar, Shalamad V'li made, that he learned, that he taught, Shamar V'asa, he observed, and he did, Shekol HaMitzvot V'Amasim HaTovim Shalom Mitalim Mitkadshim B'Kedushat Klal Yisrael, all of his mitzvos and all of his kind actions, they go up and they're elevated in the sanctity of all of Klal Yisrael. V'hu olah kekarban tamim amizbech uma, and he is like what's called a holy offering, a carbon olah, complete offering, and he is on the altar of Ummah, of the nation, the altar of the nation. So that's a heck of a start for a eulogy, by the way. I mean, you could just imagine the scene. There's a video of this. You could see the YouTube of this, and unfortunately, we become kind of callous to it in a sense, and not another sense. But like, oh, we've seen this movie before, and people screaming and crying and this and that. And like at a certain point, you can't watch it. So what happens in Israel and Yom Hazikaron is that, so there's a law that certain businesses are not allowed to be open, and they don't show regular programming on TV and papers, etc. There's only one thing that you can see on TV, and it's just testimonies, and it's on and on and on. It's mothers talking about their sons who fell, and people talking about their families, and it is excruciating. And at the same time, you can't stop watching it. I remember when I was there a few years ago, I didn't sleep the entire night because I couldn't shut it off. And you feel like this just searing pain of, I don't know, and I don't even live there, right? You can imagine the people who really, um, live this, and it's a day that they dread, and it's become a very, very heavy time, and so much so that it affects how we observe Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut, because the Rabbanut Paskin that could only be on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, because they know that everybody travels across the country to get to the cemeteries, and they don't want to have anybody traveling on Shabbos, so they move the dates so that it can happen. Okay, so. Harav Itamar Yakar V'Ahuv Yadanu Tamid She'atam Masur LaTorah. He says, my beloved Rav Itamar, he says, we know that you were always given over to Torah, la'am la'aretz, to the nation, to the land. V'hine hitbarer lanu shegam ata b'chol derachecha ma'asecha tovim. And we know that you also, in all of your paths in life and all of your kind actions, alita b'ma'alot kedoshim taharim shemasur nafshem al kiddush Hashem. And paraphrasing from the Kelmoli that we say, you have indeed ascended to the greatest heights of the holy and the pure ones who've given over their names for the sanctification of the name. B'meshach alpayim shana Yehudim nehargu al kiddush Hashem keshetfila b'fihem. He says, for 2,000 years, Jews have been murdered while they were davening. Sheyom yavo v'am Yisrael yachzor l'arteinu l'kaim ba'as haTorah. That one day that we're going to return to our land to fulfill the Torah, like we say in Elena, we want to fix the world with the name of God, etc., and we want to have peace for all the people. And this is why we were able to carry on the burden, all of these horrible trials and these sufferings, because we know that there are certain things the Gemara says. There are 3 things that are acquired with Yisurim, with suffering: Eretz Yisrael, Olam Haba, and Torah. And we know that if we accept the suffering in this world, we'll get to Olam Haba. Umos ha'olam la'adu l'shabarenu lo ha'mid shenachzor la'aretz. He says. But the rest of the nations of the world, they never thought that we'll get back to our land. They want to break us. He never thought that our desolate land would ever return and bear fruit. When he quotes all the psukim, so we could skip to the next paragraph. And again, he quotes all the psukim that give the prophecy.
Sure, I understand.
I didn't say anything to you, Siri. That all the psukim that guarantee we were going to come back from destruction, etc. So it's the second paragraph on the second column here. He says, "Od lo higato lagil shloshim." Right? He was 29. Right? He said he was 29 years old. Yeah, he was 20. He says he's not even reached the age of 30. Avokfar his pakta lirakom chalamos gedolim v'ischatel hagshimam. He says, but you already had big dreams, and you're ready to start to see them come to fruition. Bishanim has-sefarot shebehen shimishet karav o madrich hitzlachta lahalhiv bachorim b'chazon haTorah hashleima shemechaberet shemayim va'aretz me'iras hamada v'havoda. He says, in the years you were a Rav, he says, you used to teach children, used to teach people in the ways of Torah, and used to combine shemayim and aretz, the physical and the spiritual and the land. And he says, you brought it to fruition, you brought it to action. Bi'ahava, with love. He says, the way you taught your young students to learn, how you inspired them to learn Haim Lamdu, and they did. Darashta sheyachad im hatilim va'akiyufim yilamdu va'achanichim hufta'u lehivikuach ad kama limud haTorah itach haya matgar mehena ad shehem v'horiyem bikshu shekach yeh b'shana haba. He says that even as a counselor, when you're counseling Kitana as like a camp, when you're a counselor and you inspired and always talked about Torah, people always, oh, we have him as a counselor. V'ata iskamta, and you always agreed. Ki tamid hayita muchan litnadev ledvarim shebekedusha, because you always were willing to volunteer for holy matters. V'etakol lakachta ba'achariyut v'tzionot melea, and you took everything with such a decent demeanor, and you're always willing. He says, you love your new students in this high school that you were teaching in Givat Shmuel, right? He says, and you inspire them in all different types of subjects, and you praise them, and you inspire them. We waited that you should continue, that you should spread Torah and to teach and to do and to study. And we knew that it was going to be your natural path, that you were going to end up being a Rosh Hashiva, a high school principal of sort. But now all those dreams are lost. There's no one who could fill your spot. There's no one who could fulfill that vision and could bring it to fruition like you did. The next page. Nadir lerot adam shekol kach ma'arich mechabed Torah. He says also it was so beautiful to see someone who honored his parents so, which it's also one of the things that, and we're not used to seeing funerals where parents are alive. And this, unfortunately, is something that's somewhat all too common. Bebrit shel bencha Avraham, la'achar she'avicha harav Daniel siper berov tuvo al chotana sabah Rabbi Avraham. He says at the bris of your son Avraham. So again, we had many of these different children. He said one of them was Avraham, the son. He says where your father, this is Avraham's grandfather, Rav Daniel, he told about your father-in-law, the grandfather Rabbi Avraham. He says, "L'chashte bozni, halavai ve'ezkel liot kamo avi." He says, "I wish one day that he'll be like my father." L'havin la'omek et anashim, to really understand the depth of people. V'liot tzadik v'tov l'kulam, to be really righteous and good to everyone. V'od siparti li kama pa'amim ketzad imachal gomelet chesed b'atmada im kol ha'mishpacha. And he told me so many times about how your mother, how she was so kind and she did chesed for somebody and so many in the family. Pa'am keshenaseu l'chatuna im choteno harav Shlomi. One time when we went to a chasna with Rav Shlomi, he patach diyun im ra'ir she'achatan yikarei l'choteno Abba. So he says, we had a conversation. Is it okay? Is it appropriate for a son-in-law to call a father-in-law Abba? It's a weird thing always, by the way, when all of a sudden, you get married and all of a sudden like mom, dad, like everybody kind of finds what works, right? I don't know. Some people like it, some people don't like it. And maybe a first name is too formal, but mom is too weird. So we come up with these creative solutions. V'az Itamar Amar shezet tolei b'kesher. So Itamar says, it depends on the connection. Shema kesher tov v'karov, if it's a good and close connection. He says, and certainly a son-in-law should call his father-in-law father. He said his father-in-law was glowing, and he loved this. He says, this is a good story. He goes, to his wedding, he wore this very particular, nice, beautiful tie. Now, that in and of itself, did your son-in-law wear a tie at his wedding? He wore a tie? Oh, okay. Okay, so not they don't know. Ties and Israelis don't always go together. Stay on very long. Okay, okay. They know what to do with it, right? They're like, right? So he had this beautiful tie. Shibachti et hofa'atov et haniva shaviv b'tamo hatov b'charlo. He says, "Oh, I gave him a compliment." The Rav says about what a beautiful tie that his father picked out for him. La'achar kishvu'ayim. He says a few weeks later, I came home, he says, and there was a surprise gift for me. He says, a beautiful tie. Azreni Hashem, this he writes. He says, Hashem should help me. Avital, Daniel, Roni, Avram. And he says that this is what it is. The Rav says, he says, I hope that one day I will have the zechus, and he says, Hashem should help me that I will wear this tie to the weddings of your children. You were on your way to a bris when you were killed. he says the lot of our nation, of the Jewish nation, that we have to take the flag of righteousness. We have to take the flag of decency in the world. We have to take what we would call the high road. And he says, therefore, in every generation, the wicked people, they fight with us. They do war with us. And more so with the righteous people. We're trying to make the world a better place, and they're spoiling the waters, and they want to make the world an evil place. Kederach ha'avot hakadoshim shechafru be'eret mayim, in the paths of our forefathers, where they dug wells so they could bring water. Gam anachnu movilim b'atfilat mei yam uvemechzor mayim aydei shimush bekolchim. I'm not even 100% sure what this means, but I have an idea. And this is where my Hebrew is not so good, but that we have to talk about bringing goodness into the world, water which is sustenance, water which is, and he makes a play on the words. Im hayu sholem et oivenu ma hayu ma'adifim sheyargu mehem 1,000 ish o shenakim shchuna chadasha hayu ma'adifim lakiv alfei anashim b'vad shelo namshich liyashev haaretz. If you would ask our enemies, what would they rather? To kill 1,000 of us, or to have a new neighborhood for yourself? And this is an age-old question. So they would say, I'd rather kill 1,000 people so that you shouldn't live in the land. L'chein hanakama hamuka biyoter hi lahamshich livnot lahakim od shchuna lahafoch et habracha le'ir. And he says, therefore, what's the vengeance? The vengeance is not to kill people. The vengeance is to take what they don't want. That means, he says, build more. And this is a common refrain. By the way, it was a common refrain after the Shoah. I see it clearly in my mind, like it was yesterday. I'll never forget. We had it was in Long Island, I don't know, 20 years ago, and Rabbi Lamb, Zecher Tzadik L'Vracha, was the keynote speaker at the Shoah program. They had a community-wide Shoah program, and back when you had 20 years ago, you had many more survivors. And you had people that would come to a program. So, it's a packed room and a few hundred people. And everybody, like, what should our response be to the Shoah? This is, 50 years later, 55 years later, then what should our response be? And I just remember, and he just said it, like dropped a bomb in the room. And he just said, have more Jewish children. Keep having more Jewish children. I said it here. I said, be more Jewish. Have Jewish children. That's the response. So here the response is, they want to take us out of our land. Have more land. Again, this is not political. I'm not talking about being political, and a lot of people would turn this political, and by the way, there's plenty of politics in this as well, and very, very strong feelings where the halacha and politics intertwine. As a matter of fact, in the back of this volume, I'm thinking I'm going to do it over Shavuos. He has letters and shuvas from Rav Goren about Har HaBayit. What does Rav Goren think about Har HaBayit, going on Har HaBayit? And he has letters that he wrote to the different ministers. But he also has a tshuva that Rav Goren wrote about whether or not, right after the Oslo Accords, whether or not you can make peace with terrorists. Let's just say that his answer is not for the faint of heart. So depending on what side of the spectrum you fall on, you will either love it or you will be sickened by it. But okay, but that's Israel is no gray area. You can't wear a kippah sruga and learn in Panovich. It doesn't work like that. You're either here or you're here. And that's actually, aside from the million other reasons, one of the reasons why I've always felt I don't have a place in Israel personally, because I'm all over the place. And I don't really have a place where I fit in as like one of them. You know what I mean? Also, they don't need rabbis. Anyway. So this was a common refrain in all these, is that the answer is we're going to have more children, and we're going to build more. We're going to have more communities. Okay. So that he says the nekama ha'amuka biyoter, the deep-seating revenge that you can have is to continue to build another neighborhood, and to turn Har Bracha to an ear. Har Bracha has come a long way, by the way, since 2018. I was just there last summer, and it's beautiful. I don't think it's quite a city yet, but it certainly has a tremendous amount of building homes, yeshiva, like beautiful, just gorgeous. אנחנו לא חזרנו לארץ כדי לנשל ערבים הגונים מנחלתם. אבל משקמו עלינו לכלותנו, מן הדין שכל מי שרצה להרוג יהרג, וכל מי שרצה לגרש יגורש. He says, we didn't come back to the land so that we should chase Arabs away. He says, however, when people try to destroy us, someone tries to kill you, what do? You have to kill them first. Someone wants to chase you out, you have to chase them out. Ashreinu sheish lanu medina v'tzava. How fortunate are we that we have a Medina and we have an army. And with God's help, whatever will need to be done needs to be done. So you could just understand that at a moment like this, these remarks are incredibly charged. He goes on to another point here, which I mean, please, if you want to read it, you should read it. I don't think this volume was not yet translated. A lot of them are translated, and I'm curious that I'll ask Rav Malamed, and I'll ask his guy that does the translation. But I'm curious if they would translate it, if they would really translate it. Most of his translations are spot on, but that's halacha is one thing. But when you translate these types of things, it's a kind of everybody gets hypersensitive, and you're not allowed to say anything anymore. And again, I'm not telling you whether you should agree with this or not. Obviously, you can make your own decisions. The next thing he says, why do people take trumpim? See the word on the first line on top? Madua adam otamit shtamshim betrumpim. Now, this is not a political candidate selection. Tremp, if you see somebody on the side of the Israeli road and they're doing this, that's hitchhiking. It's called a tramp. So why do people take tramps if they worry about terror? What do and you speak to anybody who lives in any of those neighborhoods, and they stand outside of the shchunan, outside of the city, the moshav, whatever it is, and they take and there've been terrible stories over the years, people who've gotten into cars and they got murdered, this and that. But he said there's no other way to live. Like they are geographically spread out. It's not like they have such a sophisticated public transport system. You try to take rides with people that you know and whatever, and it goes on to a whole thing. I'm just going to skip down a little bit. No, well, he was waiting by the entrance, probably to get a ride. Yeah. So it is just beautiful words to close. He says, it's not even the end then. It's the second to last paragraph on this page. So he paraphrases from it's one of the charuzim that we have in Slichos, but really appears at the end of Ne'ilah. So we say, may it be the will of the one who hears all the tears, that the Hashem should gather all of our tears. In the Chruz, we say that we ask that God should gather all of our tears, and because we know that the gate of tears never closes. He says, but he should take these tears, our tears today, with all the tears of all the holy ones who were murdered and slaughtered and killed because of the sanctification of your name, right? Take those tears and put them in the land, and that will cause the land to grow, so it will blossom, and all the beautiful produce and the wine, etc. And you should give comfort to all those mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And turn those tears into dew of life. It will remember all of those who are forgotten. And it will answer all the whatever difficulties we have. To add bracha to all of the families of the world. He says, please give Miriam the strength to raise these orphans from Torah and mitzvos ten briot v'koach l'sabim l'sabatot l'sa'adam. And he says, listen to this, you have to, and this is the bracha you have to give at such a funeral. Please give health and strength to the grandparents so that they can support them. And to be able to bring them up and raise them, to bring them to their weddings. The last thing he says, and again, he quotes mostly from a pasuk, but he says, Ribbono shel olam ten kavod la'amecha, tehila l're'echa v'tikva tova l'dereshecha. And this is a very sort of flowery national type of prayer. It's again, this is just one incident. And as I mentioned in the beginning, 24,068 members of military services who have died for Israel, 4,216 victims of terror. And we just have met one of them. But in the merit of our learning and learning about his life and learning about what it means to the land of Israel, this Yom Hazikaron should have meaning. His neshama should have an aliyah. And we realize that when we go to Israel and we stand, we can enjoy, whatever it is that you like to enjoy in Israel, whether it's breakfast at the King David, or it's taking a tour up north, or you want to see that. But we stand on the shoulders of giants like these, who have afforded us the ability, the opportunity, the zichus, the real privilege to enjoy Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, Am Yisrael. And this is something that we have to, this is why we cannot go into a Yom Ha'atzmaut before we have a Yom Hazikaron. Memorial Day in Israel is not about hot dogs and buying a mattress at a discount or getting a car. It's about understanding that everybody is affected in some way, and everybody has Hakar Satov.
When the sirens go off and everybody stands.
It is something. And when I was there a few years ago, we Dafka wanted to be like on the main highway, so we could stop on the highway to do it. I have great video of it, but meaning that you really feel it. You really, really feel it, and you feel. I remember we were at the. I was able to get into the main tekes in the Kotel, and this was for the 70th birthday of Israel. So I was there for the 7th. I was at the Kotel with all the big dignitaries and everything, and then I remember walking back to the hotel. And of course, if you were hungry, you couldn't. There's nothing open. You couldn't get anything to eat because everything is closed. But this feeling, this eerie feeling of just heaviness, and then going from that to Yom Ha'atzmaut is really something. So I hope everybody will join us. We have a program tomorrow at the town circle for it's 5:15 it starts. Yeah, I'm actually going to be giving the keynote speech. I have a total of 3.5 minutes that I give a keynote speech, which is really challenging, and I'm last. I guarantee will not be on time. But look, we should have a Atzmaut Sameach, and we have to recognize and appreciate, and most importantly today, we have to remember. So thank you for bearing with me, which for me is always a difficult day, difficult things to talk about, but I think it's very necessary. And look, we should hopefully that all these families, and I said before, if you go to Israel, the opportunity to meet these families, you should just meet them and just tell them, I'm from America, we're all part of the same nation, I want to give you a hug. And I cannot tell you what that does for a family like this. It's really something. So anyway, we shall be well, and we'll continue with our regular programming, God willing. Next week, we'll go back to learning. What's it next week? Is it Bahar? Okay, we'll talk about Shemitah or something. So it's all have a.
Can I just share something, Rabbi? So we have friends who live in Israel, who live in Beit Shemesh, that every year on Yom Hazikaron, they specifically go to Har Herzl and to meet with and talk with families that are visiting their children, their family members, whomever, who have passed away, in terms of understanding their personal stories of what their children went through before they unfortunately passed.
That's a holy mitzvah. I shared over Shabbos, I shared a story of how one of my friends is a rabbi in yeshiva, and he takes the boys to learn at the Mount of Har Herzl. Like they tell stories. You can now get a guided tour of Har Herzl. It's heavy, but it's fascinating and extremely worthwhile in my opinion. So, but yeah, thank you for sharing that. Even if your camera wasn't on.
I apologize. There's a reason. Don't worry. I listened to the whole thing.
I believe you. Okay. Have a
You
good
know,
day.
I always have my camera on. This
I
is for
know.
all of our benefit. Let me leave it
I
at that.
I know. I'm having a bad hair day myself. So like,
Should be that.
yeah, have a good day.
Thank you.